All right, so this is the latest live stream. This one is going to be about error handling, API error handling. Very important subject, because the better that you present the errors and the information that they contain, the more likely someone is going to be able to use your API, and the more likely they are to actually adopt it in the first place. And so here we're just going to cover some basic practices and look at some a certain specification which is going to make our API return all the errors in a particular format all the time. So it's going to be quite a nice little solution that we're going to have a look at here. And we'll just do a little bit of live code. So what I've got so far, say, for example, I want to make a request. So we're still working on the flights API. Say I want to make a request, but I don't submit all of the data which is required for that in order to create that resource, then really I should get an error back. But the error should be useful to the person who is actually, or the client, which is actually consuming it. At the moment, I don't have any error handling, any validation error handling in there. So if I make that request at the moment, it's actually going to go and create that resource, which is not what we need, because here we're not submitting some vital information. And so what we're going to have a look at in this one is we're going to create a specific validation exception. And then what that will do is it will help sort of format the error in the way that it gets sent back to the client. Now, we're going to use a particular format. So like I said at the beginning, we're going to use something called problem details for HTTP APIs. And what this will do is it'll make sure that any errors that we send back, they're all in a particular format. And it's also a recognized format, which is machine readable. And it contains certain pieces of important information. And those are, the best way to demonstrate this is to show you an example. Those important pieces of information are type, which will be a URL that the client can follow in order to find out more about the problem. The title, this will just be like a title for the problem, just an overview of what the problem is. Then detail, which might contain a little bit more information about what the problem is. And then instance will be the actual the path. So in our case, if we have a problem when we're posting to flights, that should be here in instance. And then you can have something called extensions, and these are particular to each kind of error. So for example, we have this forbidden error here, then that has its own extensions, which you might not find on different kinds of errors. And then if we have a look at more something which is similar to what we're going to work on, we're going to create a validation type exception or error response. So this will be a 422 unprocessable content, but the extensions here, so the keys which are specific to this kind of error will be this one here, errors, and that will give you details of each of the validation exceptions. Just going to turn my heater off once. Well, I left that on. Okay, so let's start to write some code. I'm just going to jump on screen for a second here. Okay, so I'll talk you through where I'm up to with this repo. So we're going to sort of jump in partway through what I've been working on with the errors. So I'll show you the parts that I have at the moment. So all our error handling is going to go through a centralized error handler component, and this is it here. And so what this will do is it will intercept any exceptions, any errors which are thrown in the application, and it will take the information that the exceptions contain in order to form that problem details type response. So if you remember the keys that we just looked at there, we have type, we have title, we have detail, and then we have instance. And I'll show you where all these bits of information are coming from soon. But this is basically what we're trying to build up. But what we want to do is we actually want to add to this, because we want to add that errors key with the information about all of the problems, all of the validation errors which we encounter. So let me show you what else we've got. in order to validate our entities, so the flight entity in this case, I've created a custom validator, which is using the Symfony validator under the hood. And what this will do is it will validate an entity and it will grab the errors. That will be, it's actually an iterable object, so we'll be able to actually count, are there any errors? If there are not, just return out of this. Otherwise, we're going to initialize a validation errors array, and then we're going to loop over all of the errors, and we're going to add two important pieces of information to that array for each error, and that will be the property and the message, which I think is similar to what we've got here. So here, this one says detail and pointer. But what we're going to do is get the property. So, for example, in our case, we are going to be missing, or we're going to have blank entries for number and origin, and then just a message which will say something like that value should not be blank. So that's where we're up to at the moment. Like I say, we're not actually, the request is going through this entity validator. It is validating the entity, but we're not actually throwing any exceptions yet, and that's why it's just sailing straight through this and still carrying on to create that resource like has happened here. So let's go ahead and create the validation exception. We will have a key on there which will accept these errors, and then we'll simply throw it. And by throwing it, it means it will be intercepted by our centralized error handler. Hope you're following along with that so far. These do get recorded, so if you want to go back and watch them afterwards, that's totally fine. And also, I push all of this stuff to the repo, and I'll include details of where you can go and look at the repo on GitHub in the description to the video. Right then, so first things first, we need to create a validation exception. So I'm going to create this in sort of the same folder. I have this folder here where the HTTP error handler lives. Let's create a folder inside of there where we can put our custom exceptions. We'll simply call that exception. And then we're going to create a class called validation exception. And this will extend a particular type of extension or exception, which the Slim framework, which what this is built on, uses for handling HTTP exceptions, because this will be an instance of a kind of HTTP exception, because we're receiving a post request and we're sort of jumping on that, and we're validating the information which is posted with that request. So this is a HTTP type exception. So we're going to extend an exception, which is this one here, HTTP specialized exception. And then what we want to do is we need to think about the actual properties that we're going to need for this. So as well as the usual ones, such as the code, the message, title, we're going to need a custom one, and that will be an array containing the errors. So all of the, or most of these type of properties on the HTTP specialized exception are protected. So we'll just go along with that. Protected array, and this will be errors, and we'll just default to an empty array. And then the other things that we need will be the code. And so you're probably wondering why I've not type hinted that. And the reason is because it isn't type hinted on the parent. So when I actually try to do that, if you see what happens here, if I say int, and I get a red squiggly line, and in the bottom left-hand corner, just underneath me, I'll just jump off screen actually. Just underneath me, you'll see there type must not be defined, blah, blah, blah. It's basically telling me that I've not, it needs to match what is happening in the parent, so I can't type integer there. And then the next one that I want, I'm just going to have a look at my Scratch file because I'm cheating. So we need the message, protected message equals unprocessable content. So that is the actual, the name for your 422 kind of validation exceptions. And then after that, we need the title. And as you can see, it jumped in and it put the string in there for this one. This is going to be similar to the message, except we just put 422 on the front of that, and then protected, and this will be description, and we'll just say the request could not be processed by this server. The request could not be processed by this server. We don't need to give any more information than that. If you remember when we looked at the problem detail one here, where it was including this stuff here, the current balance is 30, but that costs 50. I think because we are including an errors array, which will contain the detail, I don't think we need to go into any more depth than that. What we do need to do, though, is we need to add a way of actually adding those errors and retrieving them. So here I've just created a getter and a setter. Get, fairly straightforward. Set errors, just going to change this to return an instance of self, simply because that is how these type of methods have been created in all of the other instances of all the other subclasses of HTTP specialized exception. Okay, that's looking good to me. So I think now what we can do is go back to the entity validator, and we can actually create this, can't we? So we'll say validation exception equals new validation exception, and you'll see that it's asking me for a request, because any instance of the HTTP specialized exception needs to inject a request, as you can see from the constructor there. So that's why I've done that, if you're wondering that. Next thing we need to do is add the errors. So the errors are going to be what we are adding to this validation errors array. So we'll say validation exception set errors, validation errors, and then finally all we need to do is just throw this bad boy. So throw validation exception, and now this should actually work, and we should see an error response. If we go and try and submit a new flight without a number or origin, and I fire this off. Okay, perfect. So we're seeing status of 422, unprocessable entity. We have a type. So remember what we said about this. This is where you can go and read more about it. Let's click on that. So as you can see, it's taken us to this page here with 422 unprocessable content, and we can read all about that there. The title is as we set it on the validation exception. Detail, again, as we put in the description on the validation exception, and then the instance is the actual path. Okay, so hopefully that's been easy enough to understand so far. The bit that is missing is the actual errors. That's what we want to add to this, the extensions, as we referred to, or as the problem details spec refers to it. So let's go back and have a think about how we can do this. And I'll also show you how we've actually set those keys on the error response that we've got so far. So we create the error like this, and then we JSON encode it, and that gets passed as the payload, and then that gets passed when we create the response and get the body, we write that payload to the body. Notice the header that we're using here. We're using application problem plus JSON, and the status code is what we get from the actual exception code. So let's go and see where we're getting these things from. Problem type. Well, I've actually created a problem detail enum. So we pass in the code from the exception, and it will actually try and get a problem detail case from that. Here we're saying 422 unprocessable content. And so when we're calling type, like we're doing here, what we will do is we'll get back a match. So for unprocessable content, we get this URL, and that's what we were able to click on and visit here. For the other ones, so title, let's have a scroll up, we're basically getting that from exception get title. Description, we're getting from exception get description. Status code is coming from exception get code. So I think that covers all of them there. We're setting detail to description. So you know how those have been obtained. Now we need to think about how we can actually add some errors to this, how we can add extensions. But if we look at these problem details here, this one has totally different extensions. It has balance and accounts for a 403, but this 422 has errors. Now, what we do not want to do is put a load of garbage code in here, which is saying if exception instance of forbidden exception, or if exception instance of unprocessable exception, because if you think about all the different types of exceptions, this could get pretty big and pretty unwieldy. We're already sort of dealing with, if you look at here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, but we could add more and more. We don't want a big if else in here. What you can use in instances like this is use a common interface, and the way to make something adhere to a common interface is to just create an interface. So how about if we create an interface with just one method on there, which is get extensions, and then all we'd need to do is check if our exception is an instance of that interface, and if so, we'll just add those extensions to this actual error. So hopefully that made sense. It'll certainly make sense if we go and actually start creating this, won't it? So in the same folder as where we created the validation exception, I'm just going to create an interface in there, and we'll call this extensible because we're going to use problem details. We want to get problem details extensions. Extensible exception interface. Okay, and then what I will do here is just add one method to this. In fact, shall I just clear myself off the screen? I always forget about adding and removing myself to the screen. So public function get extensions. No more information than that. Just return an array of extensions. And then whichever exception implements this interface, it's up to them how they retrieve their own extensions. So for our validation exception, what we want to do is return errors. But if we were creating a forbidden exception, we'd want our get extensions to return this kind of stuff. If we're building this, looks like some kind of banking app kind of thing. Okay, so we have our extensible exception interface. Let's go and actually implement this. In fact, before we implement this, let's go to the client code. I often find it better to work backwards from the client code. And so here we'll say if exception is an instance of extensible exception interface, if it's an instance of that, then we know that we'll have access to a get extensions method. So we can simply say error, and we just want to add those extensions to the error. So we're going to say exception get extensions. Now at the moment, we are not implementing this with our validation exception. We're not implementing it anywhere. So our error is still going to look exactly the same. However, if we go to validation exception, and now we are extending HTTP specialized exception, but we're also implementing extensible exception interface. Red squiggly line, because it's telling me I need to add the get extensions method. And so how should get extensions be implemented in our validation exception? Well, really, we just want to return those errors, don't we? So on here, we're going to add another key, which will eventually get added to the error array that gets JSON sort of serialized. So we're going to say return. This will be an array with a key called errors. And then we're just going to say this get extensions. not get extensions. What am I doing? This errors. So get rid of that. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. So when we call get extensions now on the validation exception, it's going to return an array with a key of errors, and that will contain the array of errors. Okay, and then that is where it's getting added to the rest of the error array, which eventually gets JSON encoded and written to the payload. So if we go and fire this off now, I'm hoping we should see some errors. Okay, perfect. So that is exactly what we get. So now we're getting type, title, detail, instance, but we've also customized this. We have a totally customized problem details type error with extensions included, and the extensions for this particular 422 type of error is this errors array here with just the details of what the problem is for each failed validated property. So for example, number, we didn't supply a number, and for origin, we didn't supply any origin there. So if we actually go and put origin in here, then we should see the error change. So we'll send this off. We should only have one error now. And so indeed we do. We only have one error, and that is for number. This value should not be blank. And so, yeah, that's what I'm going to show you for today. Hopefully you've found that useful. Like I say, I'm going to push this code to the repo. In fact, it's probably already in the repo because this is taken from a section which is now complete. So I'll record the entire errors section. And the next thing that I'm going to be moving on to is actually going to be the response content itself. So we've done error handling. We're now up to chapter 5. This course is massive. You know, it's much bigger than the other courses I've done, simply because just the nature of the beast, really. Building APIs correctly takes a lot of work. So courses that already exist, they'll sort of gloss over error handling, they'll gloss over documentation, and then someone who's just learning this stuff then goes and turns up at the first sort of gig as a PHP developer or as a software developer, and everything they've learnt, hardly any of it is usable, and there's like a big vast ton of stuff that they haven't learned. So I'm trying to include everything here which makes it pro grade. You know, this is stuff which you can take into your job, into the day job, and actually start applying it rather than just a lot of abstract stuff. That's sort of the goal of these courses. PHP Framework Pro, PHP API Pro, is to show you how stuff works in the real world. I want you to elevate yourself to like senior levels and get the best salaries, work with the best developers, and that's the whole goal of what I do. I'm not here to just do the popular fancy kind of trendy stuff, you know. All right, so if you want to know more about the course, if you're not already subscribed, I'm doing regular live streams. The next one will probably, because I've got a load of stuff to work out for the response content, probably be in 3 weeks. But in the meantime, make sure you are subscribed, because I'm sending out a load of other cool stuff at the moment. I've sent out this week a video on solid principles, single responsibility, showing you what they really mean and what problems solid principles solve, and all sorts of other cool stuff which will just help you in general as a developer and in your career. If you have any questions or comments for me, just leave them in the comments here or underneath the video when it appears on YouTube after the recording is complete. I'll come back to you, and then join me again for the next one, which will be in 2 or 3 weeks' time. If you subscribe, you'll get notifications as to when that happens. I also post out those things on YouTube as well. I'll do some shout outs for some of the guys that have tuned in. Daryl, nice to see you. Devirtualize. Rich, nice to see you. Great stuff. That's a long name. Andonian, Anya, welcome. Yogesh and Daryl again. Hope you enjoyed it, guys. I've enjoyed this one more than I did the last one, the documentation OIS thing. I sort of recorded it in the evening and It was without coffee and it was really hard, but this one's been it's been a lot of fun because I've also got to write a load more code as well. Thanks for tuning in. I'll post all this to the GitHub repo and go and grab it and have a play around with it. Cheers. See you in the next one.